So, was it ever really the good old days? There's something to be said for looking back and admiring the quote good old days. You can really envision just how great it felt to wear some of those old styles, to listen to your classic favorite music, enjoy those classic TV shows. Sometimes when you're spending time remembering those days, you might say to yourself, or maybe even to others, something like, boy, I wish it was just like back in the good old days. In some cases, you might be right. If you were talking about growing up in the 2000s, then you are probably correct. It may have been the best decade in recent memory. Just ask me, I would know. We experienced our favorite music transform from compact discs to MP3s, physical to digital. And though because we were part of that transition, we also got to experience that loathing of Skip Protect when it didn't work correctly on the portable CD players that we had to carry around. So honestly, especially for me, I would say it felt pretty amazing to get that first MP3 player and not have to worry about that issue anymore. As far as music is concerned, there was something about listening to that time period. Linkin Park, Three Doors Down, My Chemical Romance, Evanescence, The Killers, Paramore, Good Charlotte, Blink-182, Nelly, Outkast, The Gorillaz, NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, Lady Gaga, Kanye, Eminem. I could go on about this for days, but because if you're into those type of things, then, now being in your 30s, I guarantee you used to sing along with some or all of those performers at some point in your childhood, and hopefully you still do. I know I do. We saw the development of some truly classic video games, and we really got to play in real time as the landscapes became 3D. We saw Halo, GTA 3, Call of Duty Modern Warfare, Left 4 Dead, Rock Band, Max Payne, Assassin's Creed, Gears of War, Mass Effect, and again, I could go on and on about this topic, but I digress. While all those things were truly great, and I cherish those memories, and I'm sure all of you do as well, I often find myself wondering, was it really all that great back then? Of course there were these good times, these enjoyable moments, and there were life-changing experiences for us as we were growing up, as there is for everyone. But does all that mean that it was really, truly the good old days? So today we're going to take a little stroll down this lane that we've sampled so far, this memory lane, and we're going to find out, was it really the good old days, or is it just how we are remembering things? Considering the age of those growing up in the 2000s, we weren't focused on paying bills. At that point in time, at our age, we weren't buying houses and we weren't trying to make ends meet. We were kids, and for the most part, our life was much, much different than they are now. And that's really important to keep in mind. So the term nostalgia derives from the Greek root word for return and pain. So the literal meaning of nostalgia then is truthfully the suffering that is evoked by the desire to return to one's place of origin. Of most of the time when someone talks about nostalgia, they're referring to personal nostalgia or longing for moments that they've experienced in their own life. As mentioned, this experience is generally positive, but not always. And the reason to bring all this up, of course, is because this is at the root of why we tend to believe things were wonderful in the past. So we're just going to list off some things here. I'm going to discuss a few different topics about the decade of the 2000s. So I'm going to start with something that we all know too well, and that is going to be the stock market, especially in today's age and everything that's been going on through the pandemic and since. At the end of the 90s, there was a great boom economically, and the market was soaring. So unfortunately, what goes up must come down, but we also experienced the greatest terror attack on American soil. So speaking from personal experience, I can recount my exact location and everything that was going on at the time of that incident when it occurred in 2001. And there are other decades with many more memorable experiences that unfortunately we will always remember in horror and tragedy, that our generation may not have been a part of. But again, you would have people, where were you when Kennedy was assassinated, different things like that. And again, that was in 2001, so that's in our decade of the good old days. During the 2000s, we saw a recession kick off. There were actually two recessions in that decade. One was from 2001 to 2003, and the other was in December of 2007. We also saw China and India showing signs of becoming contending world powers at that point, and that began to drive the U.S. command of the world economy down. American automobile companies, General Motors and Ford, began to lose market share to Japanese makes such as Toyota and Honda. And then while all this turmoil is happening, we also see some other things. So by 2006, the U.S. economy had reached new heights after the recession. The stock market was increasing in value. At this point, we also see home prices rising. We see interest rates being curbed. And we see gas prices lowering by September of 2006, which continues to further fuel economic prospect. The Dow Jones surpasses 12,000 for the first time in history in mid-2006 and hits levels above 14,000 in 2007. But then, all of a sudden, rearing its ugly head, we start to see the housing crisis take place. So during the next few years, we see turmoil like no other. Whole neighborhoods, in some cases, are abandoned. Predatory lending practices and uninformed consumers are suddenly at the forefront of the decade from 2000 to 2010. Increased foreclosure rates in 2006 and 7 among U.S. homeowners led to a crisis in August 2008 for the subprime Alt-A collateralized debt obligation, mortgage credit hedge fund, and foreign bank markets. I'm not going to get into all those specifics, but suffice to say it was bad, as we all surely would remember. In 2008 alone, the United States government allocated over $900 billion to special loans and rescues related to the U.S. housing bubble. The rippling effects of this alone in the decade in question can still be felt today in various forms. There is something to be said for a crisis that triggers a near collapse of the modern system. Those examples, of course, waver back and forth. Not everything discussed is negative, but there is certainly so much contained within that list that it feels like we really forget sometimes what actually happened when we talk about going back to the old days. We were participants in a massive technology boom. We saw advances in those areas so rapidly. We went from flip phones to touch screens. We literally began to carry the internet in our pockets. Before the early 2000s, camera phones weren't widely available to the public. Back then, a 0.3 megapixel was the best that we could get. Now, there are cameras on our phones over 100 megapixels that are widely available. So we saw the birth of social media when Tom brought us MySpace. And, oh, did we waste it? We absolutely didn't appreciate what we had. And that is so very disappointing. But moving on, Facebook also launched and changed everything forever. We saw flash drives. We saw the birth of Bluetooth. We saw LinkedIn being launched and other professional sites. We saw YouTube launched in 2005, right in the middle of the decade's chaos. Picture a time, a world in which YouTube doesn't exist. And it's incredible because we'll be able to tell our children or grandchildren someday that we lived in a time before YouTube. Airbnb is now commonplace. And, this birthed another huge milestone for what we see in practice today that was birthed during this decade as well. So it's easy to take a stand on one side of the debate or the other and proclaim that the decade in question was extremely wonderful and you wouldn't trade it for anything. But for many, it was also a time of great difficulty. And I think that's really important here. It's something that needs to be understood is that from a different point of view or a change in a frame of reference, you can drastically affect the quality of life during the time that you fondly look back on and reminisce, saying that it was the good old days or the best days of your life. So we would love to hear your thoughts here. Comment, share, like, subscribe. What do you think of the 2000s? Was it really the good old days? Was it ever really the good old days?